Well, hey everybody, I'm back doing a little short video lecture on unions, probably since this is a law class, more along the lines of legal issues relative to unions. In order to do this, I always, and this is just me, I like to set the stage with a little bit of the historical background in terms of labor unions and why, there were even a necessity for those. Up until the 19th century, working as a laborer in this country and all over the world, really, Europe and everywhere, basically laborers were kind of peons in a kind of a feudal system, like I talked about in the lecture I did a while back on public defenders. And so, they were paid, whatever the lord of the manor wanted to pay them. Same way in the capital, free market type system where the people with the capital invested in creating the factory, hired the workers, and just paid them little of nothing. A lot of times children are required to work there 12 years old. And there's a lot of things we take for granted today in this wonderful society that we live in, that we just take for granted every day. And a lot of that was fought for by our ancestors that worked in these terrible jobs under terrible working conditions and fought, struggled, sometimes even died, on behalf of trying to make life better for themselves and their families. So basically when we look at this, I put a couple names up on here. Myles Horton is a name I wanted to mention to you. He is considered a famous adult educator from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even up until the early 70s. Myles was from Tennessee and really had a tremendous role to play with the coal miner strikes in the 1930s. He is an excellent example. Coal miners, a perfect example of people that were subject to terrible working conditions, very unsafe, a very dangerous job, low pay, and just really difficult. This still is a job that's available in West Virginia, Kentucky, and somewhat in Tennessee still today. The problem that you had is if you go way back into the early years up until like the 19th century, which would be the 1800s, you had a lot of children that were required to go down into the mines because some of these cracks and crevices were so small that only a child could fit up in there. And then the children's job too was to pick up the little tiny pieces of coal or metal or whatever it is they were mining for and put that in the ore cart, whereas the men's job was to do all the work with the pickaxes and the different ways to get the actual coal out of the ground, and then they had to pile that in the cart, the big heavy chunks that a child couldn't lift. But I mean, just at an early age, and we're talking 8, 9, 10 years old, children were down in the mine along with their fathers, helping collect up these little pieces. Now, another thing that the children often did is the mother sent them down in the mine with the father to get a bucket of coal because that was something free that they got as part of their wages, is to pick up the little pieces that they could put in their own stove and keep the house warm or cook the food or whatever was needed. And so, that's another thing to consider. One of the things that would happen is, of course, there'd be a terrible explosion by the gases that build up. And that's where you always had that story about the little small bird in the cage down in the mine, and if that bird died, then everybody knew they needed to get out. It wasn't just a pet. The idea behind it was its job was to be an alarm system for all the workers that the gas was so bad that there wasn't enough oxygen, so they needed to get out of the mine because an explosion could follow. So basically, a lot of developments over the years, but what ended up happening is in the 19th century there were a lot of riots. Molly Maguires, for example, in Pennsylvania, a lot of them were actually killed because of their role in trying to form a union. Haymarket riots up in Chicago, another example of laborers having to work. And then what ended up happening is in the 30s, Myles Horton, for example, helped to assist the families of striking coal miners. He helped to teach them how to organize themselves. It was a type of adult education. He also taught the wives and the kids, and then he would also go around to the different colleges, collect up clothing, food, anything that he could to help the miners, because if they did go on strike, they were forced off their jobs, and they were living from hand to mouth, and then a lot of times they'd actually get into a war with people that they brought in, like the National Guard even was required sometimes to shoot at striking coal miners. Also mercenaries, the Pinkertons, almost always thought of in kind terms in terms of being really good detectives, but the Pinkertons hired a bunch of thugs that would go in and sometimes they'd even infiltrate the union and then get information, and they would raid the union hall and kill all the members. Just amazing, some of the bad things. The Grange in a lot of the eastern farm states, there were farmers that were trying to force the government or anybody that would listen to them to raise prices on wheat and different things. And so the Grange was a form of farmers' union. And so there's just a lot of things that happened over time. Myles Horton was at the front of trying to help miners. There were a lot of other people that had a big role to play in trying to, help the miners. Another lady well known is Mother Jones. She was from West Virginia, and she actually went to Congress and appealed on behalf of the miners, about, that their lives were being destroyed, people were being killed. Another one, and that tells you, and because I've said in my comments about the good and bad side of the unions, is Jimmy Hoffa. He's often thought of as selling out for the Teamsters to the mafia, but in his early life, all he really did was try to make life better for his family in forming the Teamsters Union. He tells a story about truck drivers in the past. They weren't given breaks, they weren't given opportunities to rest, they had to drive for these long hours, so they would always have a burning cigarette in their hand. And if you looked at anybody that had scars on their hands, it was because they're holding a cigarette in that hand, and it would burn down and actually burn them. And they did that on purpose to keep them awake, because the pain was keeping them awake so they could drive that truck in the worst conditions when they were very tired, very sleepy, with an oversized load. And so a lot of the things that unions have done is try to improve working conditions. Child labor laws, all because of unions, okay? So if we think back, why do we have a 40-hour week? Unions, okay? Why do we have time and a half? Unions, So there's a lot of things that we take for granted today that are totally, fully available to us just because of the work of unions, okay? Now, it is true that, there were times, like even my case, I'm here to tell you, I had to be a member of a union when I was in college back way years ago, and I had to pay dues every month. And I got about to the end of my student career as a student, and I had some classes where it took a lot of my time, and I had to miss some extra days of work to try to get these classes done. and it started to affect my attendance at work. So I was called into the office about my attendance, and I had a union steward that went with me. I paid this union steward to go with me, and the union steward sat at the table right in front of my foreman, who was kind, understanding. My foreman was wanting to give me every break under the sun, because there was times when I was able to work that I'd worked all the overtime that he offered me. I did everything to the best of my ability. But here's this union steward that says, "Hey, college boy, you ought to just quit this job and move on and leave this job for somebody that needs a job." And I turned to him and said, "Look, I pay my $80 a month just like everybody else. Your job is to represent me and to try to cast me in the best light that you can to help me keep my job, regardless of what you think personally. And if you can't do that, then you just need to sit there with your mouth shut, and I'll defend myself." So, that stuff does happen. It happened to me. I also said to him later, I said, "Look, you run around and try to get these drunks and bums their job back on my money that I pay you, that are dangerous to this factory. They're a danger to me." And my thinking is, instead of you worrying about us college boys that are trying to do our best, you ought to just let those drunks go. Because we had a real big problem in this factory. People sneak out from work, and buddies would look the other way, sign them out, ring their time card for them. And the point was, they'd gone off early from work and got drunk, and they were too drunk to come back to work. Or worse, they came back to work and were so drunk they'd fall over, knock over machinery, crash into stuff, and make it very dangerous. And the union protected these people. So I have seen the good side and the bad side of unions. Now I want to flip to the good side and talk some more about my mother. My mother was a school teacher for 35 years. I don't know if you can see it in me or not, but it is true that to the extent that anybody says that I am a good teacher, it is because of my mother, who was a wonderful teacher and won a lot of awards, Teacher of the Year awards, many years in a row for being a great English teacher. So anyway, she was in the union, and she paid her dues because she thought it was the ethical thing to do. Her problem was she was a Republican. The union supports Democrats. Well, there's a lot of people out there, conservative, religious people, that don't believe in supporting Democrats, which is lunacy, and that's reserved for another day. But my mother, in spite of that, she paid her union dues because she said it is unethical and immoral for me to accept a raise from my employer that was earned for me by a union that went to bat for me to get me a raise, and I didn't pay my union dues. She said, I have an ethical responsibility to pay my union dues because they're good enough to get me a raise. Now, this is the other story about how proud I am about my mother. One time, they just couldn't get anywhere with the school board, and they weren't going to get a raise. And the law clearly says police, fire, and teachers cannot go on strike. In fact, government employees cannot go on strike. It's in the law, not allowed to go on strike. Okay? So the president of the union says, well, we're going to call a strike. We have no choice. The committee has decided that the school board won't work with us, and we've got to show them that we mean business. So my mother was kind of like the litmus test. Everybody said, well, what's Miss Dawalt going to do? Is she going to go on strike? Or is she, because, you know, she's a good Christian woman. I don't think she'll go on strike. Sure enough, there was my mom right out there on the picket line, just like everybody else. And guess what? She got arrested, just like a bunch of the leaders of the strike. Because that they wanted to make an example. So the judge had about 12 of them arrested. And, they wouldn't put him in the jail because they said, we're not going to put him in that situation. So they made him go out to, and they were under guard by deputy sheriffs, but they couldn't leave. They were stuck at the 4-H fairgrounds. So it's a funny story in our family. I'm very proud of it. She stood her ground, by golly. You can see why I'm so stubborn myself. And you know what? In honor of my mother going out on strike as a member of that union, my wife did the same thing about 10, 15 years later. So, we got a history in our family of standing up for our rights. And I'm very proud of my wife and my mother because same thing, ethically responsible for my dues, pay my part of the cost of negotiating that raise, and then in turn, if it comes down to it, then I'm going to do whatever the other members are going to do to try to bring some improvement to pass, whether it is child labor laws, 40-hour weeks, time and a half, or just a plain old annual raise that everybody deserves. Basically, they had a substantial part in pushing that forward. So there's everything I know about unions in a nutshell. Hope you enjoyed this little discussion. You can go either way on it. You can agree, disagree. I'm not here to argue one way or another. I'm just trying to put some of these concepts out there. Now, there's a good side, there's a bad side. I try to tell you both from my own experience. So take the ball, run with it, tell us what you think about unions. We'll be glad to listen. Always, be respectful of each other, just like I've tried to be, and try to give a balanced view. And we'll enjoy hearing your comments as the discussion goes forward. Thanks a lot for watching. Hope you're enjoying the class. If you ever have questions or problems, you can always contact me at robdawalt@me.com. Thank you very much.